Bill Schneider is currently a professor at George Mason University's School of Policy and Government. From 1990 until 2009, he was CNN's senior political analyst and is the author of Standoff: How America Became Ungovernable. On behalf of myself and Brandeis University, welcome, Professor Schneider. Thank
Thank
you for
you.
taking the time to join the program this afternoon.
My pleasure.
As election results trickled in Tuesday night, and as we watch results come in today, what was your initial reaction seeing how the races unfolded, and what surprised you?
Well, the first reaction I had was this is going to be a lot closer than I thought. I call this race the Waterloo of the polls because the polls all got it wrong. They did project Biden to be the winner, and it looks like he's going to be the winner, but not by a big margin. Uh, this vote I would sum up as follows: the voters were repudiating Donald Trump, but they weren't necessarily repudiating Trumpism or conservatism.
What is one voting bloc that Democrats and Republicans each benefited from that they didn't think they could accomplish before Election Day?
Well, it's easy for Republicans. They did very well, or better than usual, with Latino voters, particularly in Florida, where there are a lot of Cubans, Cuban Americans, and Venezuelan Americans who voted. Those groups, like other immigrant groups that come from a socialist or communist country, when they get to this country, to the United States, they usually vote very Republican. That's been true for Cubans since the late 1950s. It's true of Venezuelans today. It was once true of the Chinese after the Chinese Revolution. And it's also true of Soviet Jews who came from the Soviet Union to the United States. I remember interviewing in Los Angeles an elderly Soviet immigrant who had been in the United States a bit. And I asked her what she thought of the Democratic Party. And she was horrified. She said, "Democrats, socialist, patooey." And she spit on me.
Looking at swing states such as Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Georgia, what is your reaction to how close the election results are, and what do you think that is a reflection of?
Well, it was close in those states, and we're not even certain about a couple of them. Arizona, I think Biden will win Arizona, but it got very, very close. It was closer than anyone expected, which is kind of a disappointment to Democrats because they had talked about a blue wave. The polls had predicted a blue wave. I had written a column about a blue wave. The blue wave never existed. Why not? Well, the suggestion is that people didn't hate what Trump wanted to do or what he stood for, particularly his economic policies. That was his strongest suit. What they disliked was him, his behavior, his bullying, his arrogance. They wanted to get rid of him, but not necessarily the things he stood for. I remember interviewing a man from the religious right, a Christian conservative leader, and I asked him how he could support Donald Trump. Given Trump's lifestyle and his values, did he identify with those? And he gave me a memorable answer. He said, "I would never want Donald Trump to be my Sunday school teacher, but I will always vote for him for president." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because he delivers." And I said, "What has President Trump delivered?" The man said, "He's delivered the thing that we have been praying for 50 years, the Supreme Court of the United States."
That's a very, very interesting answer. Would not have thought that at all. Would
Yep.
not have thought that at all.
Mhm.
Although Democrats are expected to maintain a majority in the House of Representatives, Republicans, as you said, defied odds by defeating various Democratic incumbents. Not to mention, at least 13 new women will be joining the Republican Party in the House. What is your take from that, and how do you think it'll affect Democrats in the next few years?
Well, this is what we American government scholars call checks and balances. The voters voted to check and balance President Biden. I think there was some concern that he might be too far to the left, particularly when he put Kamala Harris on the ticket, she's a pretty solid liberal Democrat, although the conservatives also argue that she was a prosecutor and she could be a very tough prosecutor in California. But there's some concern about that. Checks and balances is supposed to mean that the parties have to work together and come to agreement. This is one of the few countries that has that separation of powers. But the result has been in recent years to produce stalemate and paralysis. That's not what voters want. And I don't think that's what they were voting for. They were voting for some degree of moderation in government.
I think what's also interesting as I'm, watching the election results come in is that, for me at least, you realize how large this country is, and that Eureka, California, and all of New York, except for Syracuse, Buffalo, and Manhattan, is predominantly Republican. Hope, Arkansas, Northern Maine. And I think that all of us as Americans are beginning, we forget. And then every 4 years, we're reminded how big the United States is and that, a lot of Pennsylvania, except the cities, is rural and predominantly Republican.
Well,
And I think it's
yeah,
something to consider.
the old joke about Pennsylvania is it's two large metropolitan cities surrounded by Alabama. Um, if you there's an old movie, I think it's before your time, called The Deer Hunter, about Western Pennsylvania. Um, that's a place which has a very conservative culture, and they love guns. A lot of gun owners voted Republican and have been voting Republican because they think the Democrats are going to take away their guns. But Donald Trump, I think, is different from other presidents, particularly other Republican presidents. The country has been deeply divided for 50 years. It did not start with Donald Trump. It goes all the way back to my era when I was at Brandeis in the 1960s. That's when you saw the deep division beginning in American politics. Um, and it's gone on for so long, people desperately wanted it to end. Trump was preceded by four presidents in a row, each of whom got elected to end the division. The first President Bush in 1988 said he would be kinder and gentler, presumably than Ronald Reagan, but he got fired after one term. Then President Clinton came in and he said he was a new Democrat and the third way, neither liberal nor conservative. He got impeached by the Republicans. Then you had George W. Bush, the son of the first President Bush. He promised to be what he called a uniter, not a divider. Well, the country was united for exactly 1 year after 9/11, 2001, when I can prove to you that a majority of Democrats supported President Bush. It ended in September 2002 when we had the tragic attacks on the World Trade Center and in Washington. And all 1 year later, in September 2002, um, President Bush and his administration announced the rollout of the war in Iraq. And with that, all the old divisions came rushing back in. Then we had Barack Obama, who made a name for himself in 2004 when he gave a speech saying there's no liberal America and no conservative America. There's just the United States of America. I'm sorry to say he was wrong. There is a liberal America and a conservative America. What's different about Trump, unlike his four predecessors, he never made a pledge to heal the country. That was never his purpose. He exploited the division. He made every issue us versus them. He's different because he deliberately divides the country. And that's one reason why he got rejected, because a lot of voters resent his divisiveness.
Do you think in the future we will see a trend with early voting by mail with Democrats and voting at the polls on election day with Republicans? Or do you think that just because of the circumstances we're living in right now with this pandemic, it is what it is?
I think the pandemic drove a lot of Democrats to vote early. One of the things we did see in the polls is that Republicans were far less worried about the pandemic than Democrats were. Um, Democrats, a lot of them are older. They worry a lot more about healthcare and public health. They were unwilling to go to the polls. So they took the opportunity, with the encouragement of Vice President Biden and Kamala Harris. The Democrats encouraged them to mail in their ballots and to vote early. We're going to see that become a little bit more common in future years, but not as dramatically different between the two parties as we did this year.
During this election cycle, the press was criticized for their bias in covering the candidates. How much of a role do you think the electronic and print media has in how Americans vote?
In what?
In how Americans vote?
Oh, oh, I don't think the press determines how Americans vote, but the press has a lot of influence. The conservatives go crazy over the press. It goes all the way back to President Eisenhower, who spoke in 1964 at the Republican convention and condemned the what he called sensation-seeking columnists. There's always been a suspicion that the press is on the Democratic side, and there's some research to show that they are. But when they do their jobs, I was with the press for about 30 years. When they do their jobs, their professional responsibility is to put their personal views aside. Now, one of the things that's changed in the last 10 years or so is the internet. The internet is not the press. You can put anything you want on the internet. Nobody edits it. Nobody fact checks it. It's anything you want to say. And from that, you get all kinds of conspiracies. You get QAnon, you get the Proud Boys, you got the Boogaloo Boys, you have some groups on the left, Antifa. They put whatever they want on the internet, and people go on the internet and find other voices like their own that they can make alliances with. That's genuinely new, and it's encouraged a lot of conspiratorial thinking and a lot of rumor mongering. So I don't think the press determines in any way how people vote. The one difference between the press and most other Americans that's widely unnoticed is that the national press here in Washington, where I am, tends to be pretty liberal and pretty democratic. And it also the people who go into the national press, the writers, the editors, the columnists, almost all of them have a college education. One of the things we know is happening in the past 10 years is that there's a growing gap between well-educated Americans, those who have college degrees, and those who don't have college degrees. Trump's base, as he's so proud to call it, Trump's base is mostly white men who don't have college degrees. Whites are split about evenly between those who hold college degrees and those who don't. Those without college degrees have been voting more and more Republican. Those with college degrees, the educated, shall we say, elite, they've been voting more and more Democratic. And the press, at least the national press in Washington, and there's not much of a local press left, but the national press in Washington tends to have a lot of educated people in it. And ordinary voters very often feel alienated because they don't have the same values as people in the national press.
Seeing as Republicans will likely maintain control of the Senate and presuming that Joe Biden wins this election, how do you think that will affect policies he wants passed?
There'll be some stalemate. There'll be some gridlock. I don't see a dramatic difference. I do think that the Republican Senate will give him a little bit of a break when he promotes his agenda. He'll speak to Congress probably in February to lay out what he wants to do as president. And I think they'll be, at least initially, friendly to him. A lot of them resented Trump, but they dare not oppose him, even Republicans, because he could control the primary votes and they could be primaried out of existence. Several Republicans were. I think that there'll be an inclination to give Joe Biden a chance. So for a year or so, the Republican Senate may be surprisingly cooperative, but it won't last very long. Sooner or later, it's just going to evaporate. When Obama was elected, he promised to hold out his hand to Republicans, and they never took it. They never shook hands with him. I remember he had meetings to discuss his health care reform at Blair House across from the White House here in Washington. He invited the leaders of the Republican Congress to meet with him there, and they showed no interest whatsoever in cooperating on the health care issue. And in the end, he had to pass it without them. I fear we could be headed for the same thing now.
Do you think that the reason why Joe Biden will get maybe more support from the Republican Party is because of his tenure as a U.S. Senator?
That's possible. Since he was in the Senate for so long, Obama had been in the Senate for only a couple of years. Joe Biden has been in the Senate for over 40 years. And he regards members of the Senate, including Republicans, as his colleagues. He knows most of them. So I think there'll be some sense of camaraderie with Joe Biden. He understands the Senate. He knows the rules. Donald Trump had no experience in the White House, no experience in the Senate, no experience in Congress, no political experience, whatever. That's one of the things that got him elected. He got elected in part to clean up the mess in Washington. And what he did is he got caught in the quicksand in Washington and couldn't do a thing. Well, Biden does have experience, and he should have, I think he does have, a lot of respect for senators whom we used to work with and members of Congress. So there's likely to be about a year of good relations. After that, we don't know what's going to happen.
What role do you think the Supreme Court will have in all this?
Well, the Supreme Court will have a conservative majority. It already does with the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett. And I think they will continue to give conservative leaning decisions. I'm not going to predict that they're going to strike down Roe v. Wade, although there's probably a majority to do it. It's a dangerous thing for them to do. And they take precedent. I think even Justice Barrett takes precedent very seriously. So I'm not sure that they'll set out to be radical and to make huge changes. The Supreme Court doesn't normally play a role directly in the political process. Cases have to be brought to the court based on issues that emerge in the country. So I don't think they'll play a very direct role the way Donald Trump wants them to. He keeps saying since Tuesday's election, he says over and over again, let's bring the Supreme Court in right now and let them decide the election because he believes he owns the Supreme Court. He doesn't. Joe Biden doesn't. The Supreme Court is very cautious about getting involved in politics. So I think they're going to respect their independence and they're going to try to remain as aloof from the political process as they possibly can. Most of those conservative justices, a couple of possible exceptions like Clarence Thomas, most of them are not eager to get into the fight and change everything that Democrats want.
Can you discuss the role of civics in our country with regards to polling and voting rights?
I'm not sure what you mean. What is civics?
Could you just talk about the ethics? Donald Trump right now has criticized how election votes are being handled and just about that.
How the vote counting is being handled, you mean?
Correct. Yes.
Yeah. Well, vote counting is being handled the same way it always is. It's a little more complicated this year because you got so many early votes and mail-in votes and absentee votes. So they have to be very cautious. But I think Americans can justifiably be proud of the way in which the vote counting process is respected by virtually everyone in the country, except Donald Trump and some of his followers. They have been trying to storm the vote counting sites and disrupt the vote counts. But most Americans want no part of that. They respect the process. I remember I was impressed at how much Americans express the process, accept the process. In 2000, when I was at CNN and we were covering the recount between Gore and Bush, the Supreme Court gave its decision in the middle of December, about 6 weeks after the election. The decision made George W. Bush president. The court actually had to do something because there was no other way to resolve the dispute. Well, what surprised me was that when Al Gore went on television that night and said, I don't agree with the decision of the Supreme Court, but they're the voice of the Constitution and I accept it. Most Americans followed his lead, even Democrats, and they said, we accept it. That's the way our system works. That's the Constitution. To me, that was a very proud moment in American history. Now, Donald Trump is not of an inclination to do anything like that. He just thinks the Supreme Court ought to act because they're going to uphold whatever he wants. But when that happened, I said, if this were any other country, including democracies, you'd probably see violence. You'd probably see rioting in the streets over a decision like that. Imagine the court making someone president in a democracy. But in this country, the respect for the Constitution and the respect for the law are so ingrained that we didn't see any turmoil.
In all your years of covering presidential elections and presidents, how does this election and covering Donald Trump compare?
Well, Donald Trump is an unusual president. I just wrote an article saying, why is President Trump different from all other presidents? That's what I call the Jewish version. Why is he different from all other presidents? Because it's not just that he's divisive. It's that he's deliberately dividing the country. It's his way of governing. He makes every issue us versus them. And I think that's resulted in the agony that the country has been experienced in the campaign this year. It's an intensely divided campaign that's tearing the country apart. My point is that Trump is different because he deliberately divides the country. That's his way of governing. He does things on behalf of what he calls his base. It's there with him. It's not a majority of the country. It's about a third of the country, not enough to win him re-election in the presidential election. But he's left the country even more intensely divided than it was, 40, 50 years ago when the division started.
On a lighter note, you were a student at Brandeis in the 1960s. Do you have any memorable stories about your time on campus?
Oh my goodness. I remember when I first arrived on campus, it was in 1962. The incoming students met and we first heard from President Sacker. And then we heard from a couple of deans. And then the next thing that happened within half an hour after we arrived was that activists were recruiting Brandeis students to go on freedom rides to the South to help register African Americans to vote, because that was the period of civil rights activism. The first thing we got involved in was politics. I majored in politics from my first day at Brandeis and never changed, ended up getting a PhD in political science. But Brandeis was, politics was very much part of the culture. I remember a couple of events. The first thing that I remember being at Brandeis was the Cuban Missile Crisis. We arrived in September 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis was in October 1962. Students were terrified. I remember some students were hiding under their beds as if this would protect them from a nuclear attack. That's the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. And I also remember that there was some tension on campus because there were a couple of faculty members in anthropology. Nobody remembers them but me, I don't think. Their names were Goff and Aberley. They were a married couple, a man and a woman. And they were defending Fidel Castro, which was outrageous. And Brandeis was under attack from a lot of conservatives because we had professors defending Fidel Castro. Well, they weren't fired because of academic freedom, but they left after another year or so. My other favorite memory from Brandeis was something that no one else seems to remember at all. In 1964, we actually had a mock Republican convention at Brandeis. Can you imagine Brandeis having a mock Republican convention? But then it was entirely possible. We imitated the pattern of the regular political conventions. We even invited the chairman of the Republican Party, a man named Leonard Hall, to be the keynote speaker, and he showed up. Now, there was a little bit of difference, of course, between Brandeis and the National Republican Party. We, mostly being from New York, nominated for president Nelson Rockefeller, who was the governor of New York. But the party, of course, nominated Barry Goldwater. I remember asking Leonard Hall after he gave his speech, I said, Mr. Hall, how do you explain why Barry Goldwater got the Republican nomination? It was a big lurch to the right for Republicans after Eisenhower. And he gave me a memorable answer, which I always remember, and I quote him all the time. He said, the Goldwater people are the kinds of people who stay till the ends of meetings. They never leave. Well, I think that's true of the left as well, but that's a key. The activist wing of the Republican Party and of the Democratic Party are people who stay till the ends of meetings.
Very interesting. As we still wait for an official winner to this 2020 election, I want to thank you, Professor Schneider, for joining the program this afternoon and for your analysis.
Thanks very much. My pleasure to be with you.